Hi, everyone, and welcome back for part 2 of chapter 6 on the structure of long term memory. This is going to be, I think, a bit of a shorter portion. We might only go like 20 or 30 minutes instead of our usual 45 to an hour. But we're going to finish up this chapter and sort of round out our understanding of the structure of long term memory before we move on next week to some more details about the processes of memory. So we left off discussing, I'll jump back to it here, sorry, the sort of major divisions in long term memory. We really spent some time discussing explicit memory and the dissociation or distinction between episodic and semantic memories and information. And so we're going to start here with a little bit of discussion about how time affects this distinction as well. So if we remember, explicit episodic memories are things that we can recall from our lives, and we can, in essence, travel back in time and see it, feel it, touch it, smell it. Right? You really have a recollection of the event versus a semantic memory, which is just knowledge, understanding, or facts. So the distinction between those two things might be something like a semantic memory is knowing that you had your 10th birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese, right? That's a fact. You know the fact that you had your 10th birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese. And then you could add on top of that an episodic memory, which is remembering the moment that like you won, 10,000 tickets in some machine, and you remember the way they were spitting out and the excitement and the smell, and you remember walking over and carrying this big bucket of tickets and giving it to the little, the guy behind the counter to get some stupid stuffed animal, right? Like all that recollection is an episodic memory, but the fact that you went to Chuck E. Cheese for your 10th birthday party is just a semantic memory. So we can make a distinction between these two things, between familiarity, which is what we might refer to as a semantic memory. I'm familiar with the fact that I had my birthday at Chuck E. Cheese, versus a recollection, actually remembering the event and moments in that event. And so this distinction allows us to understand that forgetting is not an all or nothing process. We mentioned briefly in part 1 how episodic memories can sort of have the details fade until they become a semantic memory. And this is often tested using what's known as the remember know procedure. The remember know procedure. And this is actually one of your COG labs for this module. So if you remember something, that's said to be an episodic memory. If you just know that it happened, that's a semantic memory. And the distinctions between remembering and knowing can be subtle, and people often mistake them for each other, which is one of the sources for memory errors. So we often lose, as we discussed, the details of episodic memories, particularly with time, because forgetting these details increases as we have longer intervals after encoding or the creation of the memory. So this makes perfect sense. You're more likely to remember the details of something that happened last week versus the details of something that happened 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And we see this in experimental data. Here we have people's own judgments about a memory that was either 10 years or less ago or 40 to 50 years ago. This is obviously with an older population. Now, people could choose whether they remember the event, whether they just know that it happened, or whether they're unsure and they don't know that it happened. And so we can see that what actually happens over time is that the proportion of memories that people claim to remember or have an episodic memory for, that's the green bars, declines dramatically over time. The proportion of memories that people quote unquote know, that would be a semantic memory, stays relatively stable over time. There's a little decrease, but it's much more stable than remembering. But what increases is people who just don't remember. They don't know whether that happened to them or not. So we basically trade episodic memories for not knowing. So this has led to what's known as the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. We discussed this a little bit again in part one when we talked about how the relationship between episodic memory and the future. This hypothesis suggests that episodic memories are extracted and recombined with each other to create simulations of future events, because really the goal of memory is to help us anticipate future needs and to guide future behaviors. And this is adaptive to survival and appropriate functioning. So I want you to consider the fact that memory only matters because of the future. Humans are animals, just like all other animals. We have an evolutionary history, and across that evolutionary history, we have needed to survive. We have needed to reproduce. We have needed to deal with sort of the elements of evolution, right? Survive, reproduce, pass on your genes. What would be the purpose of a memory system that just holds memories? Right? Just having a storehouse of memories is useless unless you also have a system that allows you to use those memories to adjust your adaptive functioning in the present and the future. And so really, a nice quote from a researcher that I like named Stanley Klein is that memory is of the past, right? The stuff of memory is of the past, but it's about the future. Memory only matters if we are able to use the past to inform our current and future functioning. And so this is known as the constructive episodic simulation hypothesis. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit. Instead of digging into explicit memory, we're going to discuss implicit memory. Remember, implicit memories are those that are non-conscious. They aren't things that you can recall in your mind. They consist of procedural memory, which is the easiest one to think about. This is basically what you probably hear known as muscle memory, right? The easiest way to understand these is memories for actions and procedures. It can also be the memory for sequences of actions. So have you ever maybe been driving home from school or work, right? A drive that you've made countless times, right? Hundreds of times, perhaps. And this drive is the same every day. And what your body and your brain begin to develop is a procedural memory for this route and the series of actions that take you on this common route that you drive. And this is implicit, it's non-conscious. And so what ends up happening is maybe you start to mind wander on the drive. Maybe you start to listen to the radio or a podcast or talk on the phone to your friend. And what happens is you stop really paying attention to the driving, but you're still performing all of the actions correctly because you have this procedural memory that you have developed from repeating the same sequence of steps over and over and over again. And then you have what's a fairly common experience. You pull up to your house and you go, I wasn't paying attention, right? I'm here suddenly. How did I get here? I was thinking about other things or doing other things. Well, your brain and your body were able to accomplish that task because of procedural memory. So the textbook definition of implicit memory is learning that occurs from experience that is not accompanied by conscious remembering. So procedural memories, priming, which as we discussed before, are things like if I prompted you with the color red, and then I asked you to name vehicles, you would be more likely to say like a fire truck than you would if I had primed you with the word maybe black or blue. and you might be more likely to say like a police car. So it's this unconscious association between the color red and, for example, fire trucks, right? That's learning. You have learned from your experience that the color red is associated with fire trucks. And so when I ask you to name a red vehicle, you're more likely to say fire truck, right? Something like that. And then conditioning is just classical or operant conditioning, systems of association or rewards and punishments from the school of behaviorism. Right? Those things are also considered memory and learning. So skill memory is another way that we can think of procedural memory, right? Memory for actions, like we discussed, being an expert in a sport or an instrument. It's not necessary, actually, for you to remember when or where you learned any of those actions. So once you learn how to play the guitar, it doesn't matter who taught you to play the guitar. It doesn't matter where or when you learned how to play the guitar. You know how to play the guitar. The memory for playing the guitar is actually independent of the memories about who, when, or where you learned the guitar, right? If you could delete all of those memories and you'd still be able to play the guitar. Now, what's really interesting about these procedural memories is that in particular, they help us establish a distinction between explicit and implicit memories. These procedural memories help us know for sure that there are different systems in your brain, different cognitive systems for these different types of memory. Because people like HM, we remember from part 1, HM was a patient who had his hippocampus removed. HM could no longer form new long-term memories. So if you came and visited HM and you met him today, he would be unable to encode and store that memory, and he would have no idea that you came to visit him if you came back the next day, right? He would have no recollection of your visiting him and getting to know him. He can't form the new long-term memory. But HM can learn how to play the piano. HM could get better at tennis. HM could learn how to shoot a basketball. Because those are procedural memories, they don't require explicit conscious awareness and understanding. It's a different kind of memory system. So the hippocampus is dealing with these explicit episodic and semantic memories. And if we remove the hippocampus, we really screw up this left side of long-term memory. But it doesn't so much screw up this right side of long-term memory, the implicit memories. So HM, if you let's continue maybe with the analogy. Let's say that you were hired to teach HM how to play the piano, and you come 3 days a week. You come on Monday, you come on Wednesday, you come on Friday, and you sit with him for an hour and you teach him how to play the piano. You do this 3 days a week for 6 months. Every single time you came to teach him to play the piano, HM would have no recollection of who you are, or what you're doing there, or the fact that you've ever been there. He would have no long-term memories of you. But he would get better at the piano. His performance on the piano would improve. He would remember how to play the piano, even though he doesn't remember who you are. So again, our examples of procedural or skill memories, right? Riding a bike, playing a guitar, your drive home while you're daydreaming. So let's discuss priming in a little more detail. Priming is the presentation of a priming stimulus that changes your response to a test stimulus. So we can learn about priming through a procedure known as repetition priming. And what's interesting about this is we consider it implicit memory because the person may or may not remember the original presentation of the priming stimulus. So In this experiment, we have amnesic patients. AMN stands for amnesic. They were compared to medical inpatients, INPT, inpatients, and then both of those groups were compared to alcoholics. We use alcoholics, ALC, in memory experiments because alcoholics are typically normal, otherwise healthy individuals with functioning cognitive processes, but they have memory issues. They have memory problems because of their alcoholism. So we can see that medical inpatients, so people in a hospital, and alcoholics were very good at this repetition priming experiment when they had to recall the information, and amnesics were poor at recall, right? Because recall is a semantic explicit memory. But when those same inpatients, alcoholics, and amnesics were tested for implicit memory using repetition priming, we see that the amnesics perform just as well as everyone else. So even though the amnesics don't remember the explicit information, they show implicit memory using this repetition priming experimental paradigm. So this brings up sort of an interesting idea that stimuli in your world can influence you or change your responses or memories without you knowing that they do, right? Because it's implicit, it's non-conscious. So this is called the propaganda effect, or the propaganda effect is one example of this. The propaganda effect is when people are more likely to rate statements as true simply because they've heard them before. Not because they're actually true, just because they've heard them before. So simply hearing a statement, right? Hearing a statement in the past makes you more likely to think it's true, even though hearing a statement in the past has nothing to do with whether that statement is true or not. This has incredible implications for advertising and politics. So think about advertising. This is where slogans or jingles come from, right? The one that just popped into my head is "Every kiss begins with K," right? For K Jewelers. Every kiss begins with K. Sorry, I have a terrible voice. What's the point of that slogan? The point of that slogan is when you think about love or jewelry or a kiss or the experience of a loved one, you automatically think, oh, well, K Jewelers is a good idea. Every kiss begins with K. You have this this positive association with it because you've heard it so many times before on TV, on the radio, on ads on your computer. And that repetition of this jingle causes you to sort of think of it in a positive light, or think of it as, oh, K Jewelers must be a good place to go buy an engagement ring because I hear this all the time, right? It must be true. It must be good. Maybe more nefariously, this can be used in politics. Quite effectively. If a politician wants to just lie to a bunch of people and get them to believe something, all they have to do is keep repeating it, right? Climate change isn't real. Climate change is a hoax. Climate change isn't real. Climate change is a hoax. Right? How often do you hear that in the political sphere? It's not true, right? Climate change is real. We have a preponderance of scientific evidence across decades and decades and decades in numerous fields of science that all lead us to the conclusion that man-made climate change is a serious problem. But if it serves your political agenda for people to deny climate change, just repeat it, right? Just repeat it over and over and over again, and people will come to think it's true just because they continue to hear it, just because you say it again and again and again. People will just follow along because of the propaganda effect. And of course, classical conditioning. We don't need to go over this in too much detail, right? This is the pairing of a neutral stimulus with a reflexive response. Pavlov's dogs, right? You ring the bell, they salivate. You ring the bell, they salivate. That sort of thing. We should all be pretty familiar with classical conditioning. And so the key here, the reason this is an implicit memory, is because even after you have forgotten about the original pairing, right, the stimulus still elicits the reflexive response. And so the past is still impacting your present behavior. So it is a form of memory, even though you don't need to recall or recollect anything about the conditioning paradigm. Right? The presentation of the stimulus, the bell, still elicits salivation, even if you don't remember when you were trained, right? Quote unquote. So I think one place where this has really incredible implications, again, similar to the propaganda effect, is in advertising. So here we have a series of 3 Calvin Klein ads. And, what's the old saying in advertising, right? Sex sells. So here we have Mark Wahlberg in his younger days. We have Brooke Shields, I think this is on the right, and Kate Moss, that's who this is in the middle. Famous English supermodel. So we have Marky Mark, Kate Moss, and Brooke Shields, all doing fairly, Marky Mark isn't even fairly suggestive. He's naked, grabbing his genitalia. That's about as suggestive as it gets. But all 3 of these images are incredibly highly sexualized and sexually suggestive. Why? Because sex sells. But let's think about what that means. Why does sex sell, right? What's happening here? The goal that Calvin Klein has is that you will come to implicitly, non-consciously associate their brand with sexuality, with beautiful people, right? With desire, with sexual arousal, that these images will elicit some kind of arousal and sexual arousal in you, and that your brain will pair them with the brand and the logo or the product. And so when you're in the mall and you see Calvin Klein, you don't go, ooh, I'm going to buy some Calvin Klein underwear because I like Marky Mark's abs, right? I guess some people could probably think that and thus buy Calvin Klein underwear, but it's not that explicit, right? You don't remember Marky Mark's abs when you're looking for new underwear. But what Calvin Klein is hoping is that these images will have created an association that will then implicitly influence you to be more likely to buy their products than other products. And so this is used constantly in our world of advertising, and it gets, these actually start to look kind of mild when you really dig into the idea of sex sells in advertising and how classical conditioning can be used. Here's another image. It doesn't seem that bad, right? This is Kate Moss again, right? Same model right here. This is for Obsession, which I believe is like a fragrance. It's sexually suggestive. It's not explicit, right? This is not something that would be derided as being negative or anything, right? She's beautiful and it's relatively tasteful, but where are the words Calvin Klein? Where are they? They're right across her breasts. The bathing suit is dark, it's black. The words are white, so they stand out against that black background, and it forces you to look essentially at her breasts. That's not a mistake. Calvin Klein, ad agency did not mistakenly put the brand name across her breasts. They did it on purpose so that you have to look there and so that you will associate this image and the feelings you get when you look at this image with their brand name. This one isn't even subtle at all. I think this is I want to say this is a Burger King ad. I might be misremembering. It might be like Hardee's or something like that. But this is an ad that ran online for a fast food restaurant. It'll blow your mind. I mean, essentially, this ad is for fast food blowjobs, right? Like, that's what's happening here. This isn't even like remotely ambiguous, right? They're literally implying that this woman is giving a blowjob to this fast food sandwich with and then reinforcing it with these words. It'll blow your mind away. This is the Hardee's ad, so maybe the previous one was actually Burger King. I mean, I'm not really sure what a bikini model in milk on top of a truck in a barn has to do with Hardee's, but that's the point. It doesn't have anything to do with Hardee's. It has nothing to do with the product. This is as clear an example as can be of simply trying to associate the image, the highly sexualized image of this person with the product. And I don't think it takes too much deep thought to consider why they used milk rather than water or orange juice, right? We don't really have to think too hard to figure out why they used milk. Here's an ad for Dolce & Gabbana. I mean, this is essentially simulated BDSM at best. At worst, it's the depiction of rape, right? Or the suggestion of rape. And it's all in order to sell you designer jeans, right? Or shoes. We don't learn anything about the products here, just like the last example. We learn nothing about the product except that their goal is not for you to learn about the product. Their goal is for you to classically condition an association between the brand and sexuality such that you develop an implicit memory that might cause you to be more likely to purchase their product. So, these things are not just academic, as I like to say. These issues that we discuss in psychology, and I think particularly in cognitive psychology, have lots of utility in the real world, both for good and for bad. And I think if you really look around you, you start to see and you start to notice a lot of these concepts and these ideas that we talk about coming up in real life. So that's all I have for Chapter 6, Part 2. I told you it'd be a little bit shorter than our typical lecture. Next chapter, Chapter 7, and then Chapter 8. So Module 4? Yes, Module 4. We'll be concerning ourselves with a little more details about long-term memory, as well as what I think is one of the most interesting chapters in this course, which is Chapter 8 on everyday memory and the errors of memory. So thanks again, everybody, for listening in. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 6, and I will talk to you again in Module 4. Thanks.